Tri Deltas, please welcome Executive Board Director Allison Griffin.
Good morning, Tri Deltas. That's awesome for a Sunday. Thank you. I'm hopeful that you enjoyed your day yesterday, that you enjoyed the wind down last evening, and certainly that you've enjoyed your time together this weekend. I am also certain that you are full of new ideas, lots of energy and enthusiasm to take back to your chapters, to your role, and whether you are diving into a new role or reprising a role that you've served in for years, I know that you're going to take that back with you this afternoon. So thank you all again for everything you do, the commitment you've made, not just to Tri Delta, but to your role and to the women in our chapters across the country, both alumni and collegiate women. Real quick before I get started, I wanted to mention the LDC is still collecting referrals and would love to hear from you and gather names of women that you believe are in a position to move into leadership roles within the fraternity. You can drop those referrals off back at the tech table. And there will be a drawing at the end. I think you all remember that Christy mentioned yesterday that there is a summer reading, a stack of books, summer reading list. And that announcement of the winner will be made at the end of the session. So wanted to make sure that you all knew that and get those referral slips in and back to the back of the tech table. So this morning, I actually would like to pick up on where Marianne and Amy left off last night. I can guarantee I will not be as funny, I promise. But I am full of a lot of good information and perspective that you can bring back to your role and that you can bring back to the women whom you are supporting, especially in their collegiate journey. A couple fun facts. Last night, so Amy and Marianne had put a slide up and when they were kind of laying out the presentation and highlighted the book, Generation on a Tightrope, that was written by Art Levine and Diane Dean. And so I took a picture and, of course, executed my social media strategy and tweeted it out. And last night got retweeted by Art Levine. And then got a note from Diane Dean who said, I am so honored to be a part of the conversation that Tri Delta is having about college students. And so what we talked about last night, Marianne and Amy, thank you so much. You were spot on, very relevant, very timely, and now we have to figure out how we leverage Dr. Levine and Dr. Dean, and certainly now their interest in the work that we're doing. So I thought that was really fun. So this morning I'm going to offer a few observations, a couple of comments, and just share my perspective on the higher ed landscape. And I guess by way of just introduction, for some of you whom I have not met personally, just want to tell you a little bit about my Tri Delta journey and then my professional journey, just to kind of lay the groundwork for why I am so passionate about what I do in my professional life. Of course, I serve as a director on the executive board. I also serve as the liaison, one of the two board liaisons to the foundation as a foundation trustee. And I had previously served as the executive board liaison to the center board. Prior to that, and prior to my board service with the executive board, had served on the National House Corporation board and as a CDO and a field consultant. But there was a period of time where I actually stepped back from Tri Delta for many years and had an opportunity to really grow my career and grow my family and immerse myself in my professional life. And it was during that time that I really had the opportunity to develop this perspective on national higher education policy. And I share that for two reasons. One, I wanted to give you the context, but the second reason is because I think, and this was made reference to, I think, in one of the sessions with our alumni volunteers, that you can step back from Tri Delta and Tri Delta will call again. So I think, some of us have that fear that, wow, if I say no, I may never get called back. And I will say that I said no a couple times because I was busy doing other things in my life. But the opportunity came around again. and I've been delighted to serve the fraternity, certainly over the last number of years as an executive board director. And so on a professional level, I work in public policy, specifically in the area of higher education. And a lot of times, when you're at a cocktail party or a social event and someone asks you what you do, that's what I say, right? I work in public policy, specifically in higher ed. And then their eyes glaze over. It's like, oh, that's really interesting, right? That's usually what I get. And so then I have to tell a funny story about my son. I have two boys. I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And my 5-year-old, talk about your parent's job day. It wasn't bring your parent to work. It was, you had to prep your child to talk about what you did. And my husband and I are actually both in the public policy space. We're both, kind of a lobbyist, I guess, if you will. And so I guess my son on the way to school had asked my husband, like, what do you do, Dad? And I have no idea how my husband explained his job. But all I know is when my son came home, he said, hey, did you know that Peyton's dad is a firefighter? I'm like, that is awesome. I said, what did you say that your dad does? He said, I said that he takes people to lunch and gives them money. I'm like, oh my gosh. I said, well, I guess he does, right? That's part of his job, but it's so much more than that, right? So then trying to explain, right, to my 5-year-old, now my 7-year-old, who asked me a couple days ago, Mom, what do you really do? Like, what do you do every day? I'm trying to explain, right? As a lobbyist, as someone who's interested in public policy, I really advocate on behalf of an issue that I'm passionate about. And for me, that's higher education. So I spend a lot of time doing research, a lot of time doing writing, writing papers, writing op-eds, writing short descriptions of whatever that research issue is, helping to formulate positions, communicate those positions, build relationships with people. That's really what a lobbyist does. And so my career started in Washington, D.C. I actually worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years. I was the higher ed policy advisor to the member of Congress who served as the chairman of the House Education Committee. And did that work for a number of years and really saw how Congress doesn't work. And was also, my eyes were open to the fact that our country is being run by people under the age of 35. All of these congressional staffers who support members of Congress, senators, members of Congress, they are making the decisions. They are gathering the information. They're having the conversations. They are the ones who are guiding the public policy in this country. And that's not out of any disrespect to elected officials, but you very quickly realize when you step on Capitol Hill that there are a lot of decision makers who are decades younger than you. And so it was in that, kind of current professional, or in that professional role where I really started to understand the role of advocacy and the role of the public and the role of how you take an issue and you really engage and you dive deep and you attempt to influence the way that the direction of that issue may be going. I left Capitol Hill and then worked for a couple of lobbying firms in Washington, and then my husband and I decided that we were kind of tired of commuting an hour and a half to get 15 miles across town every day and working kind of 80 hours a week, and we packed up and moved to Colorado. So we went from D.C. to Colorado, and I had my own public policy firm for a number of years in the Denver area, and then about a year and a half took a new role with an organization out of Indianapolis. We're a public charity, and we make investments, both philanthropic and corporate investments, in the higher ed space. And I've been doing all of their government relations and external relations, kind of public policy work for the last year and a half. And it's from that role that I've really taken an interest in what's happening at a national level that is impacting higher education and impacting students in the ways that we talked about last night, that Mary Ann and Amy brought up to us, all these issues that we went through, and certainly all the issues that are outlined in the latest issue of the Trident. I encourage you to put it in your bag, put it in your carry-on, and read it on the plane. It's a really fantastic issue and really eye-opening to some of the challenges that our students are facing on campus. So I have a ton of information just in terms of data points and perspective, and I'm not going to read through all of it because I want to make sure that the things that I'm commenting on are really relevant to what you want to hear about. So I'm going to lay out a couple of just observations of the higher ed landscape, but then I also want to make this interactive. And if you have questions about kind of what's unfolding, both in the higher ed environment, on campuses, maybe even within your communities or your state, I'd like to make this more of a discussion than just a keynote address. So I do want to provide some context. So for decades, higher education has been focused on access and ensuring that students of whatever age have the opportunity to access higher education. And as a result, there has not been a lot of focus on completion. So we've done a fantastic job of getting students in the door of our campuses, of our colleges and universities. But we haven't paid as close of attention to actually how we graduate them. They graduate and then they move into our communities and they get jobs. There's this new focus now on completion, and that's been underpinned by President Obama's agenda for completion. It's been underpinned by numerous education foundations who have made significant investments in higher education and programs and practices, all that build upon completion initiatives. But for a while, I guess really over the last year and a half, no one has really been talking about completion to what end. Why are we asking students to get degrees or earn a credential? And so there's just now this buzz between education and the employment community and talking about, well, it's kind of completion with a purpose, right? It's about getting a job. It's about having transferable skills. It's about becoming a good community member. I mean, contributing to your community in a thoughtful and powerful way. And so this meaningful connection between education and employment, and in light of conversations around rising student debt, right? We heard about that last night, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then also asking a key question on this kind of value of higher education and this question around the return on that investment, especially when we're talking about $1.2 trillion of student loan debt, which outpaces the level of debt of credit card holders. And so then the big question becomes, is higher education primarily for economic gain? Is it about getting a job? Or is it about developing the nation's talent and creativity? I would argue it's both. And I believe that we can be successful. U.S. higher education for decades, I mean really for centuries, has been recognized as one of the most diverse industries, the most diverse collection of institutions across the world, and long been considered the best system of higher education. The higher education has long been considered the best in the world. We have major innovations, and you probably wouldn't even think of these as major innovations unless you knew a lot about international higher education. The fact that many of our institutions have independent boards of trustees, huge, groundbreaking, actually. Community colleges. There are a lot of countries that there is not a community college option, similar sort of framework. And then this idea of open access that I mentioned earlier that we focused on for decades as a country, that doesn't exist in a lot of countries across the world. So for me, the most significant part of that too is sort of the mission differentiation that we have across all of our institutions. You have research institutions and liberal arts institutions, community colleges, faith-based institutions, comprehensive universities, kind of single purpose campuses. And so when you think about the myriad of options that are open to students, it's almost mind-boggling. I think we have close to 4,300 different institutions across this country. So talk about choice, right? Talk about, options for students coming out of high school, wondering where they're going to go or what they're going to do. They only have to choose between 4,314 campuses. The majority of students actually attend public four-year institutions, 39%. And then shortly behind that are public 2-year institutions, actually, so community colleges. So our public institution system is basically supporting well over 70% of our student population, 10 million students currently enrolled in higher education across the country. And in the most recent year in which we have data, actually 81% of all freshmen who graduated from high school in the previous year attended college in their home state. And so while there are all of these options, and perhaps we think about students who are crossing borders to go different places, the majority of students are actually staying in their home state. The challenge with that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too, is this issue of cost and the fact that our public institutions are now publicly assisted and not publicly supported. And the states are spending a lot less in their investment in higher education, and the public, parents and families, are assuming that burden, and students are assuming that burden. In terms of some demographics, so right now higher education is comprised of 57% women, so we've outpaced the men. Full-time, 61% of students actually attend full-time, and about 32% of students are underrepresented minorities. And that number is quickly rising, and so they will soon not be underrepresented minorities in terms of their demographics on the college campus. But what's interesting is when you bring a whole bunch of statistics together and you kind of blend them all, and actually Dr. Levine and Dr. Dean talk about this in their book, the full-time residential 18 to 24-year-old student, so you have to hit all three of those, full-time, residential, 18 to 24-year-old, make up 18% of the college population. So you may have a student who's full-time and 18 to 24, but they don't live on campus. Or you have someone who lives on campus and is 18 to 24, but you know what, they're actually only going part-time. And all of our policies on higher education, finance, anything that supports a student's time to degree, they're all based on this 18% number. So we essentially have 82% of our students who are not being served kind of by our public policy issues and public policies in this country. And so I provide that backdrop against a lot of the things that we talked about last night, too. We have an older student population. We have students who aren't living on campus. We have students who aren't going full-time. They're going part-time. And we have students who are struggling to find ways to pay for their education. And as we know, education determines success more than ever. College graduates earn 2 times more than non-graduates, and they are more likely to be employed. And nearly 80% of the jobs that will be created in the next 5 years will require more than just a high school diploma. I think we all recognize that. But just 30% of the U.S. adult population actually has a college degree. And so thus has been this focus on college completion. And it's not just college completion for the 18 to 24-year-olds. It's actually figuring out how do we get adults who have some college and no degree back into a higher education environment to earn that degree or credential. Like I said, we're looking at $1.2 trillion in student loan debt, which now exceeds credit card debt in this country. And we're doing all of this work against the backdrop of the knowledge economy, and of course a global marketplace where education really determines how well a person does, how well a company does, and then in that course how well a country does. And we've 4 things I want to point out. So sources of knowledge are shifting. I think we referenced this a little bit last night. So from education institutions, a bricks and mortar campus, to everywhere. I mean, there's kind of this de-institutionalized learning. You can learn anytime, anywhere, on pretty much any device. The understanding of knowledge went from very static to very dynamic very quickly. There's this openness to gaining new knowledge and also an openness to unlearning. Right? So they learn something and then they think, you know what? I've now learned something else. I'm gonna kind of put this aside and pick up something else. There's just rapid shift and very dynamic learning environment. The structure of knowledge, which used to be very compartmentalized, is now very holistic and crosses disciplines. And then the nature of knowledge, and this external authority, someone telling you what you need to know, versus now becoming very personal and very contextual to what's of interest to you or what you're doing. Students can no longer kind of fill up their knowledge tank, right, up till they're 25 and then head out on the road of life. I mean, it's really becoming a very dynamic environment, and students are finding that they continually need to replenish that knowledge and find ways to go back and connect with higher education. Because millennials who are graduating from college today are projected to have 15 careers before they retire. I mean, I think about my dad, who has had one career, and he asked me, why have you changed jobs every 3 years? What do you, something wrong? Do you not like your job? I'm like, no, I'm actually building upon what I've learned from a previous employer, taking that skill, taking that set of knowledge, and moving forward in my career. So millennials graduating from college projected to have 15 different careers. So all of this is happening, too, against a backdrop. We've just come out of this sort of financial meltdown, right? Especially for higher education. There were public funding cuts. I think we probably all read about that in our newspapers. Endowments declined about 20% over the course from 2008 to 2012. There have been just the crunches on lines of credit for institutions to be able to expand and grow and build out services, limits on tuition increases at private institutions, and then increases in tuition at public institutions. And so all of this happened within kind of a 4 to 5 year period, which is part of what drove this the amount of student debt in this country, because students really had nowhere else to go to get financing to pay for their education in a time when the economy was going down and they needed to go back and retool and reskill and get new information, right? Fill their knowledge tank, and the only way they had to finance that was to take out a loan. So there's certainly some kind of short to medium term consequences of that. The immediate response was to just freeze and just start cutting. Institutions just froze programs, they froze budgets, they started cutting budgets, they started cutting staff, not restructuring, which I think, in my experience from reading about what happens in corporate America, a lot of times there's a restructuring that goes on and maybe a rethinking of how we're actually doing our business. And like I said, a lot of our institutions shifted from public supported to essentially public assisted. And what happened is it led a lot of colleges and universities to search for new ways to generate revenue. They partnered with business. They have formed joint ventures. They've started to think about new and innovative ways to offer programs. And so as such, there's this exploding, educational technology industry, which has essentially changed and almost revolutionized the way students are learning today. Institutions have been consolidating or closing. If any of you followed what's been happening at Sweetbriar, institutions are closing their doors because they absolutely cannot afford to operate. There are cloud programs across institutions, so now you can actually be enrolled at one institution but earn college credit from another institution because they're sharing their information in the cloud, and students are accessing it that way. Institutions are truly partnering. Community colleges are partnering with four-year institutions to build out programs and degree offerings. Public universities are looking at privatizing. I live in Colorado. The University of Colorado at Boulder is likely to become one of the nation's first public institutions that is essentially privatized because of the decline in state support for higher education, and they have nowhere else to go. I think they bring in maybe 2 to 3% of their budget from the state. Transnational universities, of course, there are relationships that universities have long had across the world, but that's becoming a growing trend, and students are taking advantage of that. And then two significant changes that are impacting the university landscape: competency-based education, where students are actually earning credit for what they know and what they've done. The job that they've held, or the skill that they know, or the competency or skill that they have, they're getting credit for that. They're getting academic credit, and they're building a degree. And then this idea of coding academies and boot camps, where students participate in these very intensive short-term programs, and they earn a credential, and they're able to take that credential or that certificate and move directly into the employment marketplace. So all of this, again, this is all happening at the same time, right, as we're talking about financial aid, we're talking about sexual assault, we're talking about substance abuse, we're talking about students being immersed in a device. All of that we discussed last night is happening against this environment that is changing so very rapidly. I mentioned the influence of education technology companies. Right now, education broadly is the fastest growing sector in the country. $1.5 trillion, 9% of U.S. GDP is engrossed in some way in education and education technology, which is going through, obviously, this radical disruptive change. Mergers and acquisitions, and what I just talked about, this conversion of institutions and increasing connections with industry and being much more relevant today. So it'll be interesting to see over the next couple years how that really begins to play out, and not just play out in a higher ed environment. I mentioned I have a 5- and 7-year-old. I think we all know this, right? You have a problem with your iPad or your computer, right? Ask a preschooler, because they can help you. My boys can navigate my devices faster than I can. But it's also, the expectation that's being set, too, in the classroom is that they know how to use these devices, and they know how to, my son comes home, he does a spelling homework on an iPad. I don't sit there with a list, right, of spelling words anymore with him. I'm interacting with him virtually when I'm on the road with his homework, and we're engaging over Skype, working on homework together. It's just a very different and dynamic learning environment. So I'm going to make just a couple more points, and then I really do want to open this up for conversation. I think there are a couple things to just be aware of, or a couple key points to be aware of as we think about students and completion and what their experience has been on campus. One of the most troubling issues over the last number of years for me has been this issue of completion and graduation. So as students are moving through their degree program, we're looking right now at a national average of about 56% of students who are actually completing college, which is scary, right? I mean, one, you've made this financial investment, you've made this investment of time, but there's also been, an investment of resource by the public. And how do we begin thinking about higher education in a different and more dynamic way? And that 56% number that I just threw out, that's actually a 6-year graduation rate for 4-year institutions. And so when you start looking even at a 4-year graduation rate at 4-year institutions, that number plummets pretty quickly. There's been a drop in high school graduation rates. We've dropped from 1st to 7th in college preparation rates of 18 to 24-year-olds. And kind of globally, this idea of completion, 15th in college completion. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the landscape, right? I mean, what we're up against, and I think some of you probably knew some of that, but I think it helps to put it all in context, especially up against some of the challenges that our members are facing, social and emotional health, mental health, the college cost issue, and many of the things we talked about last night. I will say, just in closing, that Tri Delta is paying attention to all of this, not just because I'm on the board, and I hammer my board colleagues with details like this all the time, and have the opportunity to share new reports or new writing. But TriDelta is engaged at many levels in a lot of these conversations. Most significantly, our engagement in Washington, D.C. with the Fraternal Government Relations Coalition and our Fraternity and Sorority Political Action Committee, which Sarah Lindsay, our past national president, just stepped down from serving as the president of the Fraternity and Sorority PAC in Washington for the last year, and appreciate and thank her for her leadership. We have sent women to Washington, D.C., I think, is it for the last 10 years? Maybe a little bit more. Collegiate women to Washington on behalf of TriDelta and on behalf of the Fraternal Government Relations Coalition to lobby Congress on a number of issues of importance, not just to TriDelta, but to the Greek community. And then, of course, we've had opportunities to be involved in a couple different government relations task force and help to influence and bring to bear some of these statistics in this dialogue. And while this is something that I'm personally involved in and very interested in, this is something each one of you can actually participate in these activities, because you think about what I said early on about my son, right, describing what it is my husband or I do, right, give money and take people to lunch. It's much more than that, right? It's about recognizing an issue and being an advocate for that issue, being an advocate for that population. You are all advocates as volunteers. I will tell you, you know more about college women than the people in Washington who are trying to do work on behalf of college students, because you are connecting with these women on a regular basis, and you know the issues that are impacting them, and you actually have firsthand stories and you have anecdotes that are more powerful than any statistic that you can walk into a congressional office with. So as a volunteer, you're an advocate. As a member of TriDelta, you're an advocate. As women, we're all advocates, not just for ourselves as women, but for ourselves as TriDeltas as well. And so I want to leave you with that, that it's, you don't have to have pages of statistics. You really just have to have a story, and you have to be able to communicate it to someone who's either willing or maybe not so willing to listen. We have a part to play, and as a member of the executive board, we want to hear from you. And I know just in both my role with TriDelta, but also my professional role, it's really important that we hear from you and the stories that you have with the women that you're working with and the women that you all serve in your volunteer capacity. And I also want you to take what you've heard today, and next time you read a story online, or you read a story in the paper, something about higher ed you're hearing, maybe what's happening in your state, that you view that through a little different lens. Our challenge in higher education, and I sum up a lot of my talks this way, we are responsible for preparing students to address problems that we cannot foresee with knowledge that has not yet been developed, using technology that has not been invented. So I guess we have work to do. Thank you so much. So I do want to open it to questions. I think we have about 5 minutes? Okay, five or 6 minutes. If anyone has a question, yes, Jenny.
Allison, I'm wondering, how do we balance our desire to draw in TriDelta chapters? How do we balance our desire to draw in diversity, people of different backgrounds, with the fact that it may be impossible for the perfect girl to ever pay what it costs to be in a sorority?
Absolutely.
How do we bring in those first generation, financially already struggling students without giving them another unattainable financial burden?
Sure. So the question was, how do we increase our diversity and bring in women who may be requiring additional need-based assistance into our organization without burdening them with additional financial debt? that, to be perfectly honest, man, that's a great challenge. There are a couple of responses. I mean, one, I look to Tri Delta and the work that we've done even over the last couple of years in our ability to raise additional resource to provide additional scholarship dollars to women. And so hats off to the work of the foundation and the work of all of you, quite honestly, for helping to bring in additional resource to support individual members. But that resource even isn't enough to address the financial need of all of our members. I think we have an opportunity to look at our policies as an organization and just really examine how dynamic they are in their ability to support women through different financial challenges and payment plans, and of course we want them to be fully obligated and meet their financial obligation to Tri Delta, but there may be ways that, and I'm only speaking for myself, I'm not speaking on behalf of the board, but there may be ways that we can look at the way that we structure our financial policies to better support women to pay at different time periods or in different ways throughout their career. But I do want to fully acknowledge that that you're right. The demographic of college women is really changing, and we have an obligation as well as an opportunity to be responsive to that. So, yes. Absolutely. So the questions about the growth on college campuses and the impact then that has on the growing size of our collegiate chapters, and how do we ensure a personalized member experience. I don't know that I have any hard statistics on that. I know that there's a wave of more students. I don't know that. There is some research that is out there that has been done on that issue, but I don't have some of those projections. But I can say, and I'm routinely surprised by this, the fact that we feel like maybe Greek life and fraternity and sorority life get a relatively bad rap in the media, but at the same time, we are seeing membership numbers just skyrocket, right? And so I think when it comes down to that individual chapter level experience and the experience that is being provided on our campuses, I think students begin to see this opportunity for connection, and they seek that out. I think that there are a lot of conversations that go into this, but I think as we continue to look to our NPC friends and looking for opportunities to bring more groups onto campuses and ensure that the 5 or 6 chapters aren't 300 and 400 members, but perhaps we have 7 or 8 chapters that can help to bring down some of those numbers and provide a more meaningful experience to all the women who want to participate. But you're right. I mean, there is a growing number not only of just students who are coming to college and university campuses, but the number who are taking interest in the system. I also think, another challenge, quite honestly, and it goes back to this conversation about the 82 versus 18%. If we start looking at who's actually coming to our campuses, we have a lot of students who are coming perhaps as older students, outside that traditional 18 to 24-year-old range. And while they may not want to participate in traditional chapter experience, they may crave to be a part of our group. And so how do we begin to integrate women who may also have a career experience and then are coming back to campus and connect with them? I think it serves a great benefit not only to the 18 to 21-year-old, right, but it forges a new community and connection between women that I don't think has historically existed in our membership in that way. So, are there other questions? Yes.
Could you talk about at all what, if any, are the expansion efforts to community colleges? I mean, I just feel like there's
Sure. So the question was about the expansion to community colleges. So right now, and I want to make sure I get this right, Sarah, but I believe through our NPC guidelines that we are actually not, the 26 women's organizations, permitted to host chapters on community college campuses. Is that an accurate statement? Okay.
Once again, at our recent Board of Directors meeting, the subject was brought up. I know individual groups are discussing it.
Okay.
Probably more than in the past.
Okay, so Sarah's comment was individual groups are actually discussing the expansion to community college campuses more than they have in the past. So, yes.
Another thing on membership is that it's the individual groups that determine who they invite to membership, not NPC saying you must have this particular, demographic. So I think, that is something that we can see happening is individual groups may choose to change their membership requirements.
Okay. So Sarah's comment was individual groups may actually change, may decide to change their membership requirements, that is actually not something that is set by NPC. Thank you for the clarification. Yes. Actually, so NPC partnered, I think it was in the last year and a half, with the Gallup organization. And the Gallup organization, I mean, very well-renowned, polling entity, right? They just finished a long-term study it's called the Gallup-Purdue Index, where they actually measured the satisfaction of students or alumni on their college experience. And the NPC and I think it was NIC, right, there was a carve-out from part of that study that looked at the impact of Greek life on students' success later in life. And I don't have that exact statistic, but from my recollection, my just anecdotal conversations, the graduation rate for students who have participated in Greek life is higher than the overall student population. That's a good one for me to add to my list. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Great. Yes. Yep.
On your comment about Sweetbriar College,
Yes.
I do think that that is something that should be of great concern to organizations like ours.
Yes.
Where we have multiple chapters, many of them very old, on very small campuses throughout the country.
Mm-hmm.
That, looking at Sweetbriar, which kind of came out of the blue for most people, that had an $85 million endowment, yet they're having to close.
Mm-hmm.
They had lowered their tuition in order to bring in students. They had most of their students on financial aid and were not able to make it. I think that's something that we need to look at in the future for our own, where we are have our chapters in some of these campuses. What is the future for some of those colleges where we do have a home, and what's the future of our chapters? So
Absolutely.
that's a major thing that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you for raising that. And it's my observation that a lot of small liberal arts campuses are actually having conversations with one another on that very same issue, but are also thinking about unique ways to begin leveraging their experience, the experience that they're offering, and partnering with other institutions, either in their state or in other places across the country, or kind of being these laboratories for innovation to bring in some of these new ways of teaching and learning that perhaps they've never had to think about before, but they have to in order to survive. So thank you for raising that, Sarah. Are there any other questions or comments? Great. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate being able to talk to you this morning.